Hi, my name is Lindsey Collins, and today I'm going to talk about some important concepts brought up in the chapters in Cigarelli's book, Storybranding 2.0, as well as Ed Catmull's book, Creativity Inc. So I'm going to start with Cigarelli's book on chapters 8, 9, and 11. And in chapter 8, he talks about all about putting the brand first. And he says in order to have a successful brand, the company needs to not revolve it around the customer needs, but needs to stick to the brand's core values and principles. So, for example, he talks about how there's this famous marketing concept in which people believe that basically like the consumer is almost like a king. It's kind of like Burger King, or have it your way. In other words, basically like if the king is first, if you put the needs of the king first, you'll focus on what the king wants, the king needs, which is us, the consumer, and you'll build your brand around that. For brand new companies that haven't even started, this can work, but for companies that have been here a little while to a long time, the consequences of doing something where you revolve the brand around the constantly changing customers' needs and wants can be disastrous. And Cigarelli gives an example of KFC that did this, and basically the consumer, or the king, they said they wanted, healthy options and healthy alternatives. So KFC brought in this idea of, grilled chicken. We have grilled chicken at KFC now. And so, the king was like, great. But what happened after that is the sales plummeted and people went to KFC a lot less. This also happened with Gap. Gap tried to change the brand from like a classic cool blue logo to what the customer or the king wants. It's like the sexy new logo, and the backlash from that was horrible. It went all over the internet. Everyone was mocking it. It was disastrous, and basically, the Gap, spokesperson had to go on there and say, we're changing things back to the way they used to be. So overall, like, brands can't take too much change. And so Stinger really talks about that. Although, the customer or the king is constantly changing and it says what it wants, a brand can only take so much change. Another concept that Stinger really brings up is this idea of a brand having an inner layer and an outer layer. And the inner layer is basically the brand's soul, whereas the outer layer is the brand's body. And what it means, it's like the core principles and values that the brand stands for, that's its inner layer. And all the features that a brand could offer, that supports the inner layer, that's considered the outer layer. So the outer layer will bring confidence to the inner layer. So, for example, if a company claims it's a real charitable company and they do all these, we're all about, giving back to the communities or whatever, and that's what the company is built on, that's their inner layer. Their core values is, that wanting to help, that's their mission and stuff. The outer layer would be the things that they actually do to back that up. So if they give to these certain foundations and a percentage of their proceeds go to certain foundations, that would be their outer layer. So basically, it's a balancing act. You have to have one to have a successful brand. You have to have both, but the outer layer will always be secondary to the inner layer, which is primary. So again, that inner layer is the soul of the brand. It's what carries the brand. It's like the central beliefs and values that brand stands for. And if you were to change that, so like he talks about, when you put the brand first, if you were to change that and to change it whatever you think the customer or the king wants, then that brand loses its authenticity. And when people think things are authentic, they're not going to want it. They're not going to follow it. So there has to be an alignment of what the brand stands for, and not just flipping on whatever it thinks the consumer or the king wants. Those are two of the big concepts that he talks about in the book. And then in the other book, in Ed Catmull's book, Creativity Inc., he talks about a lot of really interesting concepts. He talks all about how he talks about fear and how much fear can play in our lives when it comes to creativity, when it comes to forming new ideas. And he gives this example of how he starts off by saying where this fear and failure are tied together. And he talks about how when we're all little kids, basically like in school, we would always get grades on our report card or whatever, and it would talk about how if we did bad, or we didn't study enough, or we weren't smart enough, or whatever the case was, that would be a sign of failure. So people were kind of like primed to believe that failure and fear go hand in hand, and sometimes having that big fear of failure stops us from from going after things. And so basically, that was one of the big concepts I found in here. And so he talks about how instead of being so afraid to fail, that we should see failure as a consequence of doing something new. So if we're never changing, we're never evolving, then we're not doing anything new. And failure is actually a sign that we've gone an uncharted area. And it even talks about, like, it makes me think about, like, with science. So, when scientists are trying to test a new theory, for example, they're going to put out a hypothesis out there, and they're going to basically try to either prove it right or prove it wrong. And from that experiment, they may, prove their hypothesis, or they may fail to prove their hypothesis. But either way, they're getting closer to a truth. They're finding out if there was a correlation or there wasn't a correlation. So even though they may have failed, by not proving their hypothesis, they've still proven, or they've still, gained some knowledge from that, and there is some benefit from that. So basically, Catmull's like saying that fear shouldn't be seen as a necessary, failure should not be seen as a necessary evil. It should be seen as a consequence of doing something new and uncharted that should be valuable. So that's one of the big concepts. And he talks about how Andrew Stanton was like a big time, player in the Pixar company. And he talks about that you got to get in there, you got to fail early and fail fast. Because once you start failing, then you're on a right path to something new. I really like that. And then Catmull also talks about this concept of how when it comes to leadership, lots of times if a leader is willing to be humble and talk about their failures, then a lot of people are more willing to not have that, that fear-based culture. And he talks about how to get out of that fear-based culture, and he gave an example of like a retreat that him and his Pixar, I think it was the Pixar animators or producers went on. And basically on this retreat, he told, all of them that, hey, I felt like an imposter my whole life. And he's like, raise your hand if you feel like an imposter. And basically everyone in the whole room raised their hands and said they felt like an imposter. And so he talked about what he did is he told them, basically ways that he had failed and he had messed up. And what that did is it made it, this fear of failing not so terrifying. Where, hey, like I failed is what this leader was saying. And you're going to fail, but it's okay. You can still move forward. You can still go on and do great things. And so I really like this concept. It really spoke to me. And it really made me think of, I used to be in this organization called Ignite Texas. And it was this Christian organization where I was basically a Christian counselor for these girls, incoming freshmen and transfer students that would go to the University of Texas. And basically, I was like their mentor. I get them connected. But I remember when I was in that group, I instead of just being like, high and mighty, like I have it all together and trying to pretend like, I have this perfect life and this perfect Christian, I was vulnerable. And I told them, ways that I had fallen and I had struggled, but that God had helped me get through that. And it was so powerful because I remember, certain girls in my group just started like bawling because it's like they had struggled with similar things and felt like so far from God where they felt like they couldn't come back. So it opened a door for them to be able to, to pour out, what was on their hearts and for us to connect over that and for us to pray about it and bring it to God, And if I had never, been vulnerable like that and said, hey, I'm a human, I've fallen many times, I'm flawed, then it wouldn't open the door for them to do the same thing. So that really spoke to me. It really hit home because I know from, my personal life that is definitely rung true. So another concept that they talk about is this concept of in chapter 7, the hungry beast and the ugly baby. And I found this to be really interesting. So basically, that's over this. So basically with Disney, they went through this period where they had this constant need to produce and to make a mass amount of films and stuff to get out there. The consumers wanted a lot of stuff, and they had this constant need. So it was like they called it feeding the beast, the Disney beast. And on the other side of it, they have when anytime like a animator or director or writer would come up with a new idea for a film, they'd call it an ugly baby because like when people have a new idea, it's an ugly baby because it's usually an ugly mock-up. There's going to be several more mock-ups before, you know, they actually make it to a nice, pristine, you know, Disney movie, or sorry, Pixar movie. And so basically, with this concept, it really hit home with me because he talks about how, you know, when you have a new idea, or, you know, whatever it is, when you have a new idea, it's like this ugly baby. It's vulnerable. It needs to be nurtured. It needs a lot of attention. It needs to be protected. It needs to be protected from naysayers. So, like, because basically, if you don't protect that idea, then people have this chance to put all this negative input on that idea before that idea ever comes into fruition. So he talks about, you know, when these animators or writers come with these new ideas, they have to protect it. And so, but there's this constant balance that they have to have between, you know, protecting the ugly baby, but also feeding the beast. And so instead of, you know, one or the other being seen as, you know, a negative, you know, the ugly beast can be good with the deadlines and the, you know, the things that they have to get done at a certain time. But the ugly baby is kind of like, it has to be protected. So it's just this balancing act they have to do. And that is what, you know, kind of fuels creativity. And for me personally, this really spoke to me because I feel like a lot of times, I know for me personally and a lot of people I know, we've had, you know, dreams or visions that sometimes that God's placed in our hearts or that we just have had. And when it's such a immature stage, such an early stage, it's easy to allow a lot of input to be put in and to crush the ugly baby, or crush that, you know, that dream or that idea that we have. So this really spoke to me of wanting to protect things that I feel like God's put in my heart before I expose it to the world. And it really made me think about the way I view ideas I feel like that I've gotten. So yeah, this chapter was really insightful and really powerful. And I really enjoyed these books, and I hope you got something from it. And yeah, thank you so much.